insights you've shared. Thank you very much. Now we move on. Following the highly anticipated summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, both Russian and Ukrainian media have offered contrasting views on the outcome. Russian state television, including channel RU-24, has reported that the summit yielded no new sanctions against Russia and no breakthroughs on Ukraine, but emphasized the diplomatic victory for Putin. Meanwhile, Ukrainian outlets, including Telemarathon, criticized the lack of a ceasefire agreement, calling the summit's results disappointing. In an interview after the meeting, Trump has rated the summit a 10 out of 10, despite the absence of tangible outcomes, advising Ukrainian President Zelensky to seek a deal. President Putin was warmly welcomed in Alaska, marking a symbolic return to global diplomacy after years of isolation. Let's listen in to the Russian news presenter.
Москва рассчитывает, что Киев и Европа не будут мешать прогрессу, который наметился в украинском урегулировании. Такое заявление сделал Владимир Путин на пресс-конференции по итогам переговоров с Дональдом Трампом. Встреча в Анкоридже, которую еще до ее начала называли исторической, завершилась. Визит российского лидера на Аляску продлился 5 часов. Основная часть мероприятия состоялась на военной базе Элмендорф-Ричардсон. Свои оценки прошедшей встречи с президентом России уже дал Дональд Трамп. По шкале от 0 до 10 он поставил переговорам 10. В интервью телеканалу Fox News глава Белого дома заявил, что Вашингтон и Москва согласовали, в частности, вопрос о гарантиях безопасности для Украины. Трамп призвал Киев пойти на сделку с Россией, а Европу поучаствовать в украинском урегулировании. И добавил, Вашингтон не планирует вводить новые санкции против Москвы и ее торговых партнеров.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian outlets, including Telemarathon, criticized the lack of a ceasefire agreement, calling the summit's results disappointing. In an interview after the meeting, President Trump rated the summit 10 out of 10, despite the absence of tangible outcomes, advising Ukrainian President Zelensky to seek a deal. Putin was warmly welcomed in Alaska, marking a symbolic return to global diplomacy after years of isolation. Let's listen into the Ukrainian news presenter.
Угоди про перемир'я немає, але і санкцій поки що не буде. Таким є результат зустрічі Трампа і Путіна на Алясці. Американський президент, попри відсутність будь-яких помітних досягнень, запевнив в інтерв'ю американському каналу Fox News, що переговори минули на 10 з 10 і що тепер, мовляв, справа за Зеленським, якому він радить прийняти угоду.
News outlets across Europe have been covering the high-profile summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. While both leaders described the talks as productive, no agreement was reached on resolving the war in Ukraine. French channel called it a highly orchestrated return for Putin to the global stage, while Germany's Tagesschau reported the summit ended with no concrete outcomes. The BBC pointed out the silence from Ukrainian President Zelensky, who was not invited to this meeting. After nearly 3 hours of talks, President Trump and President Putin briefly addressed the press, mentioning progress but offering no specifics. Let's listen into what some of the news presenters have said.
Good morning. It's Saturday, the 16th of August. Our main story today. The US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin have failed to reach an agreement to end the war in Ukraine at their much-anticipated summit in Alaska.
After a nearly 3-hour meeting, the leaders gave a joint press statement in which President Trump said great progress had been made but declined to give any details or take questions from the press. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky wasn't invited to the summit and hasn't yet commented.
Das Gipfeltreffen von US-Präsident Trump und dem russischen Präsidenten Putin in Alaska ist ohne konkretes Ergebnis zu Ende gegangen. Zu einer möglichen Waffenruhe im Ukraine-Krieg äußerten sie sich nicht. Beide Staatschefs sprachen aber von produktiven Gesprächen.
Marqué le point justement hier soir, tapis rouge, avion de combat et beaucoup d'aimabilité. Un retour sur la scène internationale à la mise en scène très orchestrée pour Vladimir Poutine. Poignée de main historique avec Donald Trump en pleine guerre toujours en cours en Ukraine.
Now for this discussion, we're joined by Sander van Hoorn. He's a former EU correspondent, joins us live from Brussels. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to NewsX World. Given this EU's firm stance that Russia cannot dictate Ukraine's NATO or EU's path. How do you see it? How is EU seeing it?
EU, I think, is glad that there's no result because that beats a bad result. We've seen bad results after Trump-Putin conversations where Trump adopted Putin's line. Now, that has not happened, but what has happened, everybody is still grasping. EU leaders, including Ursula von der Leyen and the presidents for example, the UK, France, Germany, Poland, have been briefed after the meeting by Donald Trump. The NATO was also present in that conversation, but still details are scarce about what was discussed, what was agreed upon. Trump suggesting that some points were agreed upon, but what are those points? So I think Europe is still reeling and trying to grasp what exactly happened in Alaska.
And is Ukraine or EU preparing diplomatically and militarily for this potential Russian retaliation again?
Diplomatically, yes. EU is in constant talks. After being briefed by President Trump, EU leaders continued their conversation, and I guess they will keep doing so in the coming days, especially since President Volodymyr Zelensky is visiting Washington on Monday. And everybody is trying to scramble to put Europe at the table, maybe not directly, but then at least in consultations before and after negotiations, because Europe is paying the bill right now in Ukraine, supplying a lot of the weapons that are being used now. And they say it's a war on our continent, so we should be involved in any solution. And as they point out, Ukraine primarily should be involved. There can be no territorial concessions to Russia without explicit consent of Zelensky and the Ukrainian population. So those are the basic lines of the EU, and they will guard those lines. But how can you guard them if they're not at the table? That's still the biggest issue in the EU.
And Sander, now, how does Ukraine view the proposed trilateral summit with you mentioned already, but President Trump and European leaders? What concrete outcomes would they hope to achieve?
Well, if there is going to be a trilateral summit, because we've seen speculation about that happening in the past. It would have happened, for example, in Istanbul, Turkey, and then Putin declined to show up. So basically what you see now, I think, is Zelensky calling Putin's bluff. So he agreed to this trilateral meeting that is suggested by President Trump, waiting to see basically what Russia does. Will Russia send Putin to this trilateral meeting, or will they chicken out in the last instant and putting the blame on Putin? And that's basically a silly game, but that's sometimes how it works with President Trump. He has got to lay the blame somewhere, and Zelensky is trying to have him place the blame on Putin if a trilateral meeting is not going to take place. Now, if it's going to take place, the big question is when. How much diplomacy will we have seen before that trilateral meeting? Will there be like a concrete proposal before that trilateral meeting? There are so many ifs and buts that it's quite frankly pointless to speculate on it.
Thank you very much, Sander Van Horn, for joining us and sharing your insight. Always nice hearing from you. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump